Right at the beginning of our series, I asked this question: how do we live as followers of Jesus in a society where we don't call the shots? Perhaps there's been times in our history when society was, reflected a Christian perspective. Perhaps there was a time when people wanted to hear what Christians had to say, but now, certainly not so much. We're certainly a minority in a context where other people are in charge. They dominate the board, and often for many of us it feels like there's just a move or two away for us from being in this losing checkmate position. So this question again is before us: how are we meant to live as followers of Jesus at school, at uni, at work, in a culture that doesn't share Christian values, at least in the way it possibly did in the past? And that question really launched us to look at this book of Esther, where the people of God were the minority living in a world where they weren't in charge, where they certainly didn't call the shots. And there's been lots of takeaways for us so far from this series, isn't there? Reflections from our times together, reflections from your own reading. I've heard some of you speak about the takeaway for you being, the reversal of destinies. Remember, Haman was on the rise, and yet he takes this gigantic fall. Mordecai was falling, and yet God raises him up from the depths. And it's just a reversal of destinies. And perhaps that gives you this reminder that pride comes before a fall, giving us perhaps a lot of hope in the challenges you're facing, but also a reminder of the posture of humility we need to have as we engage in our cultural landscape. Some of you have also highlighted the way Esther and Mordecai were used by God in effectively secular jobs. Our heroes are not prophets, they're not priests, they're not pastors, they were ordinary people with secular, ordinary, non-religious jobs. And yet it's these ordinary people who were used by God to make extraordinary change in the cultural landscape of the day. Another takeaway for many of you is this inspiring story of Esther we saw last week. Esther, who chose not to use the palace to hide, but to use her place to help. And reminds us that we have a place to help as well. We shouldn't bury our heads in the sand, but consider our place in life and how God can use us in times like this. We could take that even further, as some of you have, and consider again how it was a woman who stepped out and secured peace for the people of God. And as a Persian kingdom where a woman's value was measured largely by the size of her dress, this book of Esther is very pro-woman. And the way that Esther stepped out in a very risky way, shouldered the weight and the future of her people. And that's why we as a church certainly want to support our women in God's calling that He has for them. And throughout our reflections, we've seen also that all of our motivations behind any change we might do in society is not simply brought about from some inspirational story from Esther, but really about our Savior, who reverses places with us, moves us from depths to heights, provides us with identity, security, glory, that we have nothing to prove, we have nothing to fear, we have everything to gain in this relationship with Jesus. So today we come to the end of the book. We've gone through a whole bunch of the events in the story. Years have gone by. Since then, Xerxes has been assassinated. It happened in 465 BC. History tells us that he lost the battle against Greece, even though all the odds were stacked for him. After an affair with his daughter-in-law, he got himself into all sorts of hot water. He was eventually assassinated. Esther and Mordecai have lived out their days, and the Jews were saved from an effort to wipe them out completely. And the author gathers his readers together and summarizes the story and its significance. And one of the main purposes for the author is to explain why there is this feast called Purim and why that feast of Purim should be celebrated every year. Now, Purim's not a feast that I really understood a whole lot until really jumped in to prepare for this series. Jews still celebrate it today, and the people of God back 2,400 years ago were encouraged to do the same. We're going to have a taster of this feast of Purim today and come to realize actually that we celebrate something like this as Christians probably every single week. This is what we read towards the end of the book. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews near and far throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes, calling on them to celebrate an annual festival on these 2 days. He told them to celebrate these days with feasting and gladness by giving gifts of food to each other and presents to the poor. This would commemorate a time when the Jews gained relief from their enemies, when their sorrow was turned into gladness and their mourning into joy. So the Jews accepted Mordecai's proposal and adopted this annual custom. Haman, son of Adimmath, you get it? The Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted to crush and destroy them on the date determined by casting lots. The lots were called Purim. But when Esther came before the king, he issued a decree causing Haman's evil plot to backfire, and Haman and his sons were impaled on a sharpened pole. This is why the celebration is called Purim, because it's the ancient word for casting lots. So because of Mordecai's letter and because of what had happened, the Jews throughout the realm agreed to inaugurate this tradition, to pass it on to their descendants and to all who became Jews. They declared that they would never fail to celebrate these 2 prescribed days at the appointed time each year. These days would be remembered and kept from generation to generation and celebrated by every family throughout the provinces and cities of the empire. The festival of Purim would never cease to be celebrated among the Jews, nor would the memory of what had happened ever die out among their descendants. I mean, who would have thought the book would finish with this massive celebration? The first half of the book, things looked really bleak. There were multiple challenges. The people of God were just a move or two away from being in a losing checkmate position. Powerful people dominated the landscape, and the people of God had this death notice over their heads. In the middle of the story, when faced with notice that they just had 11 months before it would be legal for anyone to kill Jews and take their property, this is what we read in chapter 4. And as news of the king's decree reached all the provinces, there was great mourning among the Jews. They fasted, wept, and wailed, and many people lay in burlap and ashes. But now sorrow has been replaced with this spontaneous outburst of joy. We read, they were filled with joy and gladness and were honored everywhere. In every province and city, wherever the king's decree arrived, the new decree, the Jews rejoiced and had a great celebration and declared a public festival and holiday. I mean, what happened? I mean, those are complete reversal of destiny again. Complete reversal of spirit and change and countenance. Last week, we got to the stage in our story where Esther, embracing her identity as one of the people of God, went into the king, with full of courage, went into Xerxes and asked him to step in and do something to save both her and her people. The king had Haman impaled on the super gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. But he said to Esther, well, I can't just change a Persian edict because, the law can't be apparently overturned, can't be rescinded, it can be counted. So a new edict is put in place. It uses a lot of the same words from Haman's edict to show it's, again, a reversal of destiny. The change is in the people. It's now legal for Jews to defend themselves. In addition to all this, there's going to be all this national and local authorities coming into support. So when the date finally arrived for where it was legal to kill Jews and take their property, the Jews found it was also legal to defend themselves against their armed enemies. And the law says that they never, even though the law says they could take the enemy's property, the Jews chose not to, and they survived to live another day. And then there was this outburst of spontaneous joy, leading to this new feast called Purim. Now in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Moses had given 5 feasts for the Jews to celebrate. This one's in addition to all of them, and it's not actually something that was, kind of commanded of the people. It came out of the people. It came out of their desire because they were so happy at what had happened. They had survived as a nation. And the name of the feast, Purim, comes from this old Babylonian word meaning lot. Haman, the 2IC to the king, had, got upset with Mordecai, and as a result of that, wanted to destroy Mordecai and his entire race, the Jews. And to come up with a date to do that where it would be legal to kill the Jews, he effectively took a dice, known back then as a lot. He threw it, and it led to a date, 11 months to come, where it would be legal to do that. The Babylonian word for lot, for the dice, effectively is pur, from which Purim comes. Then there's actual kind of this double entendre, this double meaning in the word. Our English word lot probably has something similar to it. We can refer to lot, as like this chance selection, as in like something like lottery. But when we might refer to kind of destiny, your lot in life, your destiny. Both of those ideas are also summed up in this word pur as well. They're both brought into the story. So when the original audience heard the word Purim, they were reminded of the story of Esther. How Haman had cast the lot, the dice, and everything looked like it was about to change, and yet their lot, their destiny in life was completely reversed because there was somebody behind the scenes. Earlier this week, I met with the Auckland Synagogue and went down to see the rabbi there and to ask him a little bit about how Purim is celebrated today. And he was incredibly hospitable. He pulled out the scrolls. We read Hebrew together, or at least I tried to read some Hebrew together. I'm really rusty. It's been years since I've done that. And he explained how Purim is celebrated today. I thought we'd put a few of those snapshots together to hear some of his comments as we wrestle with Purim today.
So we celebrate Purim according to the Hebrew calendar, of course, which is the 14th and 15th of Adar. Around February, March, that's the time for Purim, according to the Jewish calendar. It's a very special festival, very happy festival, taking into consideration what could be the end result if, God forbid, we didn't have the miracle of Purim happen to us. Haman was so upset with Mordechai not bowing down to him, and he decided, wow, why should I just kill Mordechai? Which, if you're upset with someone, you should kill just him, I guess. If do something so terrible, why to destroy the entire nation? Here we see the core of anti-Semitism. It's not just Mordechai, it's the entire nation. There's something about the religion, about their ways of life that is so different, and this is what Haman says. So we have, in the halakha, the Jewish law, points out 4 things that one should do on the day of Purim. So first of all is the reading of the scroll on the evening and on the morning of Purim. The reading of the scroll is the main part. This is how we celebrate, how we magnify the miracle, and we advertise the miracle to the world. Reading of the scroll. Second is called mishloach manot in Hebrew, sending food items to each other to increase the joy and friendship amongst the Jewish community. And then also you give a gift to the poor. You have to give enough money, so to speak, so the poor people can have enough money for another mitzvah of the day, another commandment of the day, which is the festive meal. Another tradition is to dress up on Purim. Last year I was a Kiwi rabbi. I dressed up like a Kiwi bird. This year I was a Jedi. So in honor of Star Wars, the new Star Wars, I was a Jedi rabbi. And here the whole synagogue is people coming with different costumes and dressed up in funny stuff, which is great, to increase the rejoicement. So I see Purim in a way that I'm totally connected in the spirit of Hashgacha Pratit, the divine providence. But if you believe, okay, you come to at peace. And you say to yourself, okay, I don't understand, this is something above me, but I truly have the confidence in God that He will lead me to a better place. And that's it.
There's a lot of laughter in this festival of Purim. The rabbi highlighted some of those things that happened, things like the reading of the scroll, reading of the story. And as we did here a couple of weeks ago, whenever Haman's name is read from the story, we had our clappers out and you try to drown out his name because that's kind of part of what happens in the story as part of one of those traditions. It was certainly a challenge for me that day as a communicator with this going on kind of the whole time as well. There's all these dress-ups as well. As he said, he dressed up as the Kiwi bird, or he dressed up, the Star Wars character. We might even see some of that happening in our foyer today, just as people kind of dress up and enjoy some of the story. And the reason probably behind that is the way Esther masked her Jewish identity. And so people dress up and kind of reminisce some of the story and, again, just enjoy some of these moments. There's a lot of feasting around tables. And one of the feasts, actually, one of the little pastries that is core to the Jewish tradition is this pastry called hamantaschen. And we have some of those out in our foyer today to enjoy as well. It's something to try, with chocolate and, all these other things in there. You'll enjoy it. It's free for you after the service to enjoy. So we get a bit of a taster today of Purim. But the whole heart of the festival is the spirit of joy and of laughter. The folks in our story at the time of Esther are able to laugh because they experienced two things, I think. And I want us to focus in on these couple of things today as we think about the meaning for us 2,400 years later. The first one I want to draw your attention to is Purim is a reminder of providence. Providence is one of those theological terms referring to the way God governs people, events, and circumstances through the normal and ordinary events of human life. And all this generally happens behind the scenes in a way that you don't see God, in a way that God is behind, but he's fully present. So at the beginning of the story, in Esther, you'll remember, it's like challenge after challenge after challenge. Persia is a place where things are not right. The world is not a safe place. So powerful men like Xerxes reign, and he treats people as if they're just pawns for his own selfish purposes. He parades his power and his stuff to show off his importance. And then there was people like Haman, prideful men who can never get enough honor. Even people like Esther, a daughter of God, finds herself in situations that are morally ambiguous. What she does is questionable, but then how much say did she have in what was going on in her life anyway? She certainly used. It didn't look at all, did it, like God was present or God was in charge. Remember, nowhere in our story is God's name even mentioned anywhere in the book. On top of that, as we've seen, there's no one praying, no miracles happen, no prophets show up to deliver God's word. There's no plague sent from heaven. At first glance, it's as if God was on holiday during the time of Esther. And it's like the author has deliberately left out the name of God because this is how the people felt at the time. It's what many of us feel when we're in the eye of the storm. And it's like this book is placed in our Bibles. It's like God has placed this book right here in our Bibles because this is his answer to us when we ask that question, where is God? In times like these, in these difficult times, when we question God's presence, when we question God's power. It's like God is inviting us to re-look at our situation again with new eyes and see how he is involved, see how he is very present, albeit behind the scenes, even when he appears silent or muted. So we read this, our own story, as we read the story of Esther, and we see how coincidences just seem to happen. And they cause us to sit back, don't they, and to ask, is there another character who's hovering over the board, another character who's actually directing where the pieces go and what's happening on the board? You know, what we know as providence. Remember some of the things in the story again as we recount them. Remember when we saw it when Haman throws the dice and it falls to a particular date, which will be 11 months to come. And he sends out an edict on a particular day to let the Jews know it's going to be legal for you to be killed. And that date just happens to be on the eve of Passover. It's remarkable timing. Remember, Passover is this festival where Jews come together to celebrate how God delivered them from slavery in Egypt. And no doubt they're sitting back celebrating, well, God, you did this then. But, I mean, could you do this now in a different kingdom, at a different era? You know, we can celebrate history, but God, are you still present today in this context where there is this death warrant over our heads to come in 11 months? They were asking, God, are you present? Because, God, we look around and it doesn't look like you're very active in our world. And every time they heard the word Purim, they thought about the dice. And they realized again, like that verse we saw in Proverbs, that many of you took away in a dice that week. We may throw the dice, but the Lord determines how they fall. God is providentially involved. We saw this providence where Mordecai just happens to hear about an assassination attempt, tells Xerxes is saved, but Xerxes just happens to forget about it. And then 5 or 6 years later, Xerxes has his bad night's sleep. He has his attendants read to him, and they read to him about Mordecai saving him, and the king suddenly remembers that he's never been honored, and so he wants to honor him. And then it just happens by chance that Haman is coming in to speak to the king about how to kill Mordecai right at that very moment. And suddenly this reversal of destiny happens, and just by chance, again in the timing. Amazing timing. Or you might remember there was another device the author used at the time called a chiasm, where the whole center of the book turns on this, what we would see as a really insignificant phase, but everything hinges on it, just that phrase that the night the king could not sleep. And suddenly all the evil plans that Haman had are overturned, and everything changes from that point, all because the king had a bad night's sleep. And we're reminded again how God just does something so ordinary to change the course of destiny. We're reminded again that God is at work, even in a drunken party, Vashti's decision to say no, a sinister beauty pageant, a dream one night, the rolling of the dice. You see, that's why people laughed and they dressed up and they celebrated. It's why we can laugh today. We laugh because we know that earthly power is just a big show. In the end, it is God who uses the weak to humble the powerful. Nothing stands in his way. We laugh because we serve a God who can use orphan girls to reverse the decisions of a king and rebellious pagan queens to put it all into motion. We laugh because God is not just involved in the miraculous and the spectacular. He is active in the ordinary, random events. We laugh because even though God is invisible, silent, muted at times, he is present in every scene of the movement in the story. Now, I just don't want us to just sit back and think about history. I want us to think about our own story. There's some cards at the end of some of the rows. If you could start passing those down. If you don't have a pen, grab a pen at the same time. I'd like you to think about your own story for a moment. On the left of the card, there's a question that what challenges are you facing? I'd like you to write down some. We're not going to, you're not going to pass these in. This is just between you and God. But it's often good to just see things in ink. Some of you at the moment are praying again and again and again, and it feels as if God is not listening. Is God there? Is he hearing what you're saying? This challenge you might be facing. Some of you are facing challenges at work, at uni. Some of you are experiencing headaches with your kids. You know, their hearts they're just trying to get them to do something. It's just a challenge for you. It might be a challenge in your marriage, a challenge in your relationship. It might just seem there's some situation in your life where it just looks like God is distant. It seems like things are getting worse, even when you pray. And some of you right now are even facing doubt. Well, is God even present? You look at the way people are treated. You look at the things that are happening in our world and the injustices that are going on. And it just seems like, really? How does all this happen? Pretty similar situation and challenges to what was going on in Esther. The book encourages us to look at our challenges, to name them, to almost like write them, see them down here in print. And you can start writing that, carry it on while I'm talking. And then right next to that's another question. How might God be directing behind the scenes right now in your life? There might be things that you want to write down while I'm talking. It might be that you want to do this later on. It might be a reminder of things that happened in Esther, and you kind of place them in there to remind you that God is actually present in your challenges you're going through too. We think of the chain of events that happened in your own conversion. Maybe you were randomly changing channels on TV one night and you came across a TV preacher, and looking back, you cringe upon that speaker and what they said, but the timing and the content of it was exactly what you needed at that particular moment. Or you picked up a postcard in a local restaurant about our Christmas Eve services here at Green Lane Christian Centre, and you ended up coming to Christmas Eve services and into our community, and then you joined our staff, as one of our staff can vouch for. Or ask, how did you come to meet and marry your spouse? I'm guessing there was a chain of events that led to that. How did you come to be in your current job? Or perhaps you run into an old friend who provided much needed support and encouragement at a particular tough season in your life, and it was just kind of this random encounter, it would seem. Or perhaps God brings somebody to your mind, or you run into an old friend who's going through a tough time, something that you've gone through yourself in the past, and you're able to be used in that place and that time to bring encouragement. You see, even tragic situations, like the death of a child, broken relationships, shattered dreams, wayward children, they are never good. But somehow God works even through these activities. He doesn't cause them to happen, but he's able to bring hope through it all. He's present, and he's doing something. And it's like the author wants us to identify our challenges, and then besides that, see God's providential activity and presence. And ask, could it be that God is at work behind this broken world in such a time as this? Could it be that God has placed you in your job, in your neighborhood, in your home, in your situation for such a time as this? Could it be that God can bring something good out of your situation in such a time as this? Some of you have memorized a verse like Romans 8:28, which reminds us of this, doesn't it? And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. You see, Purim is about providence. God is at work behind the scenes. God does some of his best work in the shadows, hidden from view, obscured by vision. But providence is also about purpose. It leads somewhere. This whole aspect of providence isn't just by its own, but it's leading somewhere, it's going somewhere. And that's why Purim is not just about providence. It's about peace. See, why was God doing all this in the book of Esther? It was to bring peace. You see, the history of Israel is full of these tense moments. They began when they were slaves in Egypt. They went into the wilderness and they were attacked. They were attacked in the land. They've always been on high alert. This desire for them, for peace, for rest, has always been there. In Esther, they were under attack. And the author, again, draws us to the fact that they experienced peace. We read, this feast would commemorate a time when the Jews gained relief. The Hebrew word, they were, also the same word for rest. They gained rest from their enemies, when their sorrow was turned into gladness and their mourning into joy. That phrase, rest from our enemies, is used a few times throughout the Hebrew scriptures, at times when God was reminding his people that they would experience not tension, not conflict, not kind of all this attacking, but rest. And Purim is a reminder of rest, relief, peace. Usually our holidays commemorating warfare and strife are celebrated on the day the battle itself. Think, Bastille Day in France on July the 14th. Even Anzac Day, when our troops landed on the shores of Gallipoli. Purim here, that the people don't celebrate the day of the battle itself because it's not about the battle they're remembering as such. Purim is a celebration of the day after the battle. The battle is not what it's about. The date for them, to use the Jewish calendar, the date of the battle was Adar 13. The celebration happens Adar 14 and Adar 15. You see, it's not a celebration of victory in battle, but the rest that comes. The peace that was experienced. You see, the day of death has come and gone, but God's people are still standing. And the result of all of this story, all this activity, is that they now have rest from their enemies. But here's the thing. It didn't last. It was temporary. And throughout Jewish history, there's been different characters, Moses, Joshua, David, all used by God to bring rest from their enemies. But a rest that was always temporary. It was always for a season. It was always for a time. They experienced trouble, they experienced challenge, they understood that things aren't right in our world. They understood, as we do today, that there are injustices, there's abuse, there's people who ignore you, attack you, misuse you, lie to you, drop you, avoid you. But when peace comes, there's celebration. But for them, it was always temporary. And so the prophets in the Hebrew scriptures spoke of a Messiah who would come and bring rest, bring peace, a rest that would be eternal. And they described this Messiah, they described this one to come as the Prince of Peace. And about him it was foretold, his government and its peace will never end. He will rule with fairness and justice for all eternity. And so Jesus came. And rather than use the palace to hide, he used his place to help. Some of the people thought he would step in and take up arms and overturn the Roman enemy that was before them. But Jesus understood that the real enemy actually isn't these people. The problem we have is enmity and evil. And that exists in each one of us. It's expressed in pride, it's expressed in selfishness, it's expressed in the abuse of others to get ahead, to get noticed. So Jesus came to deal with the real enemy, which is enmity. And it couldn't just be forgiven. It had to be dealt with. It couldn't just be left because justice is always needed. Justice matters to God. It's typical in our culture, isn't it, that when someone hurts you, you have this intrinsic right to hurt them back in some way. There's this intrinsic need in us for justice. But the problem, of course, is that when you seek revenge, you might get some temporary rest. Your enemy's hurt or your enemy's out of the picture, and it kind of feels good, doesn't it? Your enemy's now silenced in some way. But what tends to happen is that they regroup or they seek revenge or there's these tribal wars and revenge happens. New generations take matters upon themselves to get even. And this cycle of abuse, the cycle of evil, the cycle of enmity just continues and continues and continues. But Jesus dealt with the core of the problem, and he satisfied the very need for justice. So Paul wrote in Ephesians, "For Christ himself has brought peace to us. In his own body on the cross, he broke down the wall of hostility, that wall of enmity that separated us. Together as one body, Christ reconciled both groups to God by means of his death on the cross, and our hostility or enmity toward each other was put to death." Enmity is resolved, justice is satisfied. And because of Jesus' death, there is rest, there is peace. And it's not temporary, it's eternal, it's permanent. That's why the end of Esther for us isn't Esther, it actually goes all the way to the end of the Bible in the book of Revelation. And we catch a glimpse of these final days where John writes, "He," that's the Messiah, this is Jesus, the Prince of Peace, "will wipe every tear from their eyes. And there will be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. All these things are gone forever." And the one sitting on the throne said, "Look, I am making all things, making everything new." There's rest. And it's not temporary, it's permanent. And in that context, we read of this great feast. You could think of it as the ultimate Purim. Death, sorrow, pain are replaced with laughter and joy and rejoicing, just as it was here in the story of Esther, but it continues on for all eternity. And while that's to come, the victory will happen. And that's why today, none of us need to seek revenge from our enemies. It's why we can follow the words of Jesus and turn the other cheek. It's why when someone robs you of one shirt, you offer them another. It's why we can use our place to help. It's why we can have courage and take risks, because we have nothing to lose and everything to gain. I mean, think about it. What's the worst thing that can ever happen to you? You might have your possessions stolen, but you have everything already in Jesus. You might have your name trashed, but you bear the very name of God on you. You might even lose your life, but at the very next moment, you stand in the presence of God, full of glory, at peace. And that's why the Christian church is able to continue to persevere. The Spirit of God being upon us, and victory can happen. Now, we don't tend to celebrate Purim, but as I mentioned earlier, we want to celebrate that today. We have some tasters in the foyer. We'll kind of get into that kind of laughter moment. But effectively, most weeks, we celebrate kind of a taster of Purim whenever we take communion. We take this bread, we take this cup, and we remember what it is that brings us laughter, what it is that brings us peace from our enemies, from enmity. It's what reminds us that there is the ultimate Purim feast to come. Sometimes people are a little solemn as they take it because, we realize that this involved the death of our Savior who reversed places with us. But it can also be a time of celebration, laughter, joy, festivity, spontaneous outbursts. We laugh because we remember that God is involved in all situations. We smile in our belief that enmity is dealt with on the cross. Our faces beam because Jesus rose again and offers life to anyone who chooses to identify themselves with him. And we cheer at the realization that we have nothing to lose and everything to gain. And so we remember that God is present. hovering over the board, oftentimes silently, directing people like you and me, and directing events of whatever kind, all towards his purposes. May you know that God is providentially bringing about rest from enmity and from evil. May you know that God is able to use ordinary people who use their place to participate in this mission that he has of renewing people and renewing places. And may we as a church remember the story of Esther, a story about presence, a story about place, a story about providence, and a story about peace. Let's pray together. Jesus, we come as your people, your followers, and we come to this table of to feast, to celebrate. We realize it's just simple elements of bread and a little cup, but it's just full of festivity, it's full of laughter, it's full of joy. It reminds us that there is so much to celebrate of what we have in you. And so we come today and we celebrate your providential involvement in our lives. And we come and we celebrate peace, that we have rest from our enemies. In Jesus' name, amen.